Welcome to Licking Non-Vanilla, a sex-positive hour of talk about kink, sexual mores, and writing dirty words. So grab a cup of cocoa, your favorite easy chair, and the lube as we go sailing into the dark, sweet waters of all things naughty on Licking Non-Vanilla with your hosts Ralph Greco Jr. and M. Christian.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Licking Non-Vanilla with Ralph Greco Jr. and
Myself, Chris, otherwise known as M. Christian.
all the way there and across the country for me. but we're connected by the heart, right, Chris?
That's it. Heart so far and get a couple drinks in us. Who knows what else?
Who knows? Yeah. When men are men and women are women and Wolverines are Wolverines. We've gone through a couple subjects so far on the show, and this is one that Chris and I come across all the time. People ask us this question all the time. Beyond, can we take a nude picture with you? We hear that all the time too. But this is the big one, I think, Chris. This is what's the definition and the difference between pornography and erotica? And answer in 20 words or less.
Starting now.
Hack. Yeah. What do you think? Do you have a good definition or a good difference?
It's funny. It's like this is one of those things that, like you mentioned before, it's kind of a big question because it's like I can't remember who said it. I'm sitting in front of my computer right now. You think I could look it up real quickly, but I think there's a Supreme Court judge who said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know what I see it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Kind of the same way with erotica. I mean, it's like there really isn't a way of like breaking it down.
Mm-hmm.
At least as far as I know. I mean, if you have any thoughts on that, let me know. But I know some people have used the definition that pornography is just about sex. Erotica is sex and something else.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not even sure half the time if that's even all that accurate. It's one of those things. It's like I don't know. I mean, it's like it's. I don't think there really is kind of a delineation that much. It really depends because, like, very often, like even mainstream literature will have more sex in it than supposed erotica or pornography.
Yeah.
Again, just because it's labeled as, being, non-erotic,
Right. Well, it's like a you say potato, I say potato kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, there's some stories I've read in places where I did not expect a big jolt of erotica, and I got it.
Mm-hmm.
And like typical places like we've tried to sell to, like Esquire, Playboy, or like the New Yorker, heavy
Mm-hmm.
duty houses for fiction, or at least one time they were. And I've read some stuff that I was surprised at how erotic it was, or
Mm-hmm.
dirty it was, downright
Mm-hmm.
dirty. So I guess it is a kind of my definition was pornography is more like a slot A into slot B kind of description. And
Mm-hmm.
then erotica is, like you said, fills in the gray spaces, But then again, who knows,
Exactly. And you're right. It's like I've read some pieces on mainstream fiction that's like, oh my God, that's just porn. But,
Right.
Because the writer was like, a mainstream author and very well respected. It's like, they can get away with it. I mean, and it's funny because a lot of mainstream writers have written straight up erotica and other ones, kind of hide behind it. But some are like, very clear about what they're doing. But yeah, it's like, I don't know. I mean, it's like, sometimes I don't like it when people, it's kind of like, it's going to sound really weird, but it's kind of like, it's like the word. It's like, I don't like it when people call me, a pornographer. I can call myself a pornographer,
Mm-hmm.
but don't you call me that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You only play one on television.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well,
Exactly.
I think what you're talking about is a stigmatization categorization of and Chris, we've seen that be true for the science fiction writers that we love. Oh, they're just a sci-fi writer, which doesn't mean they're any better or worse a writer than anything else, But
exactly.
We've seen those labels. Same with comics. We've seen it across with comics. How could that be good literature if it's comic books? Kind of thing. And I think if you see somebody like I don't know, did you catch the there's a great documentary playing on I think it's on Amazon Prime about Ellison.
I haven't seen it yet.
It's great, and it's called Darkness with Teeth or something. I forget. Anyway, and he wrote a bunch of stuff that fell into a wide bunch of categories. And I mean, generally, I think he would consider himself a fantasist. But within that, we've always talked about this cross-genre thing. You could certainly explore erotica and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And it's funny because Harlan actually, I mean, it's not something that a lot of people know about, but he actually wrote a couple of, I wouldn't actually call them erotica, but he wrote some pretty, some tawdry books back in his early career. And they're still, I think some places are even reprinting them to a certain extent. And it's funny because at the time they'd probably be labeled as something like, torrid or, tantalizing and so forth. And, at the time they were kind of like their version of porn, but it's like a lot of writers have done this. I mean, in fact, I have a funny story. I hope it's true. It could be apocryphal, but I always heard that for a while there, science fiction writers and other people in other genres would get together and have a contest to see who could get their letter published in like Penthouse Letters or something similar, using under a different name, and whoever did it first would win like a bottle of booze or something. I always loved that, but it's like a lot of writers in other genres have written really explicit stuff. I mean, Sam Delaney, it's like the same year. I know people are going to be yelling at me in the background. I can hear you already. The same year he wrote like Dahlgren. He also wrote like, what was the name of it? He wrote this really explicit, really outrageous sex book, and I can't remember the name of it. I actually read it. And it was like, oh my God, this is like, Well,
I mean, there's a bunch of guys that were writing, not getting paid for pushing out great science fiction stuff, or getting paid very little. But the men's magazines at the time were paying. So a lot of these guys were trying to get published there because they were making money at least. And,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And speaking of, I finally looked it up. The book is called The Tides of Lust, and it was published in 1973 by Chip Delaney. It has a different title, but that's the one I was able to find. But yeah, I completely agree with you. It's like, it's like many times, it's like, I know like there's another story, speaking still about Harlan, where, he was like selling to like magazines like Cherry and all this kind of stuff. Because they frankly paid better than a lot of the science fiction magazines.
Yes, exactly.
Now his stories weren't erotic, but
No, but he was dead. No, I mean, there's also the artist for Superman, the original Superman, did some erotica, and then Dr. Seuss, there's some erotica, and then
the guy who does Dan DeCarlo, who does Archie, also did a lot of like he did some explicit stuff, but mostly he did things like, kind of like girls comics and that kind of thing that were obviously kind of like designed to be titillating as opposed to like stuff in Archie. But it's like this is a long tradition.
Yeah. And the famous case of the guy with Wonder Woman. Who created Wonder Woman, which I mean, there was a movie made about that recently, right? That he had
it's a great movie, by the way.
He had polygamy. He was involved in polygamy, right?
Well, polyamory, but exactly.
Polyamory,
it's like,
right. Okay.
Marston. He's fast. If you ever get a chance, the movie is called Marston and the Wonder Women. I may have mispronounced his name, but I can look it up here. And it's actually a really excellent movie. I saw that one.
That's a recent movie, right?
Yeah. It takes a little bit. Yeah, it's called Professor Marston and the Wonder Women.
Okay.
And I highly recommend it because I saw it. It's not exactly 100% accurate, but
Mm-hmm.
it's still fun. But yeah, it's like there's a long tradition of this. I mean, for a while there, I know Playboy. I'm sure our friend Jean Marie would probably yell at us because she's much more of an expert than I am. And
Right.
if I remember correctly, Playboy back in the 70s tried to start up their own kind of science fiction imprint, and they solicited, quite a number of writers to contribute. And unfortunately, the project didn't go very far. But I know Philip Jose Farmer did his famous, or should I say, infamous image of the beast.
Mm-hmm.
Because Farmer loves doing about sex anyway. But
Right.
yeah, this is a long tradition of this. So it's
Right.
like, as long as there's been like people, making stuff, they've been making sexy stuff. And sometimes it's because they want to, and sometimes it's because it pays better.
Yeah, no kidding. So how do we make the distinction then with film as opposed to literature?
Yeah, see, that's weird because film has always been really strange because I mean, you've got like the ratings board, which the more you read about the ratings board, the more you realize it makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
Because you've heard the famous joke, of course, if you cut someone's head off, you get an R rating. If someone gives someone head, it's X.
Right,
It's just like it makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
And they used to slap X ratings on all kinds of weird films back in the day.
Absolutely.
I think like Midnight Cowboy was rated X.
That was rated X.
The Exorcist was rated X. It's like it's so funny. It's like when you look at these films now, it's like, seriously?
Yeah, and the difference between, like, I know Clockwork Orange was a famous X-rated film, and what a great movie. And there's some stuff in there I can see disturbing, but you could go onto Clips for Sale, you could go onto RedTube, and download to your heart's content XXX stuff all over the place. But then there's websites that have delineated sections. There's some stuff that is certainly softer, which you and I would consider more erotica than porn. And then there's niche content, which kind of falls into that area, like what we write when we do cross genre, or fetish, So because there's all these different subsections now, I don't really know what's like. If you watch a strictly spanking film and there's no sex involved, then is that just erotica and not pornography?
That's an excellent point. I mean, like a lot of BDSM films, you find there's no actual penetration, there's no orgasm, there's no sexual contact. So technically, it would be rated R, and be considered like softcore. So it's really kind of funny how that really works out because you're completely right. I know a lot of like vintage films, of erotic content were just basically just strippers. I mean,
exactly.
they didn't have any, they didn't have like any kind of sexual content. That changed, after a point. But I think it's still kind of interesting that it's like, a lot of these were like, pretty tame by today's standards.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm like you. I tend to bristle when the labels and the categorization is coming down. Because for guys like you and I who write a wide variety of stuff, because we are widely talented and incredibly good looking, I think the restrictions hamper us more than they do us any good. There's time because I don't know what I'm trying to say. I guess writers know where they're selling to. So we don't particularly need the label put on us. We know, well, this book is a book of these kind of stories. Then we put that story there. We don't need the characterization beforehand. And I certainly say, and you've certainly said to writers who are just getting into this kind of stuff, or anybody making anything in general, don't worry about what the thing is. Just do the thing. But the characterizations and the stigmatizations halt too many people from getting out there and doing something, I find. So I don't like to use those labels. Even pornography and erotica, I don't.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's like the only problem is it's like it's funny. It's like this is typical, and it's like this is one thing that's like the big secrets they don't tell you about publishing and all this kind of stuff. But if you're a writer and you're doing things like stories, it doesn't really matter. Like you said, you can definitely say this, that, and the other thing. Um, but the when it comes to publishing like books, if you're dealing with Amazon, the instant you hit that little button when you upload the book that says explicit content,
Mm-hmm.
the rules completely
Yeah,
change.
and that's true. That's very true.
So if you did like we mentioned before, if you did like a mainstream book that happens to have explicit sex, but it's a mainstream book, or the publisher is considering it a mainstream book, then they don't look at it the same way they look at books that are labeled explicit content. So it's really kind of gets kind of weird in that regard. But yeah, you're right. It's like I don't necessarily like the idea of like labeling and such, because I know you have too, done some stories now and again where it's like oh my God, I forgot to put the sex in it.
Yeah, right. Okay.
It's like, ah, crap, I forgot to put the sex in, or something
Right.
similar. It's just like,
Right.
it's one of those weird situations where you're like, it's like, oh, it's like, what is sex and what is erotica and so forth. And, like you mentioned before, sometimes when you're talking about BDSM stuff or you're talking about fetish stuff, there's actually no penetration, there's no orgasm, but it still often is labeled, as being like explicit or, erotica or something.
Right. And words like explicit, kinky, all those things,
Mm-hmm.
they don't mean anything
Mm-hmm.
because it's all subjective,
Mm-hmm.
Because we have either edited, you more than me, written, worked with plenty of people and editors and publishing houses where that line of not only what they're looking for, but what how erotica it is, how pornographic it is
Mm-hmm.
certainly different than the last guy we worked with.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that definition is so nebulous,
Mm-hmm.
because you and I have certainly sent stuff to certain places that, well, we want this kind of a story, and we send it and it's like, well, that's way too kinky,
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
that's not fetishy enough, or that's not this or that, so those definitions are so subjective.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's funny, it's like it's not just like, it's not too, and most of the time it's not even things like it's not like some overseeing organization. It has to do with the publisher or the
Yeah, of
editor,
course.
what they say. And, it's worse when it's people who want to like, pigeonhole you, or people worse, it's like, someone with a bug up their ass who wants to
Hmm.
send you to jail, so, the good news is, yeah, we haven't seen those kind of things for a while, because for a while there, it was really kind of scary. I remember this is probably, when was this? God, I'm so old. It was probably around the 90s or so. And I remember this is like the early days of the internet. And I remember hearing a horror story and about someone who was running a BBS, which is a bulletin board system, which is really
Yeah, that's
way
pretty
in the
old.
prehistory of the internet.
Right, right.
And they had gotten, they had run an adult site or an adult BBS, and they got extradited to a different county across the country and prosecuted for pornography. And that was, like I said, that was pretty scary times,
And that's
because
not too long ago.
yeah, not too long ago.
Yeah.
And there was this whole big thing around that time about oh, like there was also the Meese report, which is before that. So it's
Yeah.
like pornography's always been scapegoated. But the good news is, I think now, because the internet being so essential, that if you create adult content, unless you're doing something that you should be thrown in jail for, they're not going to come after you. But yeah, it's like it can be really difficult. I mean, I remember the one thing I was hold on to, and excuse me before I go on here for a
Hmm.
second, but the speaking of like pornography, or I guess you could call it like inappropriate, or what'll get you banned, or frankly what should get you banned, is like the five deadly sins, which is the things you can't really write about.
Yeah.
At least as far as like Amazon and these other companies are involved. But if I remember correctly, it's non-consensuality, which is
Right.
basically rape,
Right.
underage, which is obvious,
Right.
incest,
Right.
bestiality,
Uh-huh.
Um, how many have I listed so far?
That's
I can never
4.
remember. That's 4, and the fifth one is pee and poop.
See, and all those things in the conceptually make sense, but
Mm-hmm.
there are gray areas that we have all tackled in our writing about all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and that's the
Absolutely. I mean,
right.
it's like, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, and that's what we talk about, these gray areas.
Mm-hmm.
And because to blanket and say, look, you can't write anything about incest, but
Mm-hmm.
you see fantasies about stepmom, auntie, and I'm using that
Mm-hmm.
word in quotes, so it's like anything else. You throw these big, no, you can't do that, but there's also there's always gray areas,
Mm-hmm.
um
And like example, I mean, you've written tons of age play things, and
yes,
age play is one of the things where it doesn't have to. This is one thing people don't understand. It drives me crazy, and I probably know it probably drives you crazy too. It's like age play does not involve children. It
right,
involves adults pretending to be younger
right,
than their actual age. And but you're right. It's like there's always kind of gray areas around it. Like there's a whole consent, non-consent thing, and
right,
frankly, erotica is a fantasy anyway. So you don't have like I still remember like someone's talking about kink and like erotica. And it's like, yeah, we don't have the 2-day negotiation and the and
yeah,
the reality of having sex these days, of course, and which
yeah,
is the way it should be anyway, is like asking consent before everything, mainly because it slows the story down and the stories are fiction. But
right,
you're right. It's like bestiality. It's like, well, what about all the werewolf books
right,
or
exactly,
that kind
aliens.
of thing? And aliens, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just to let you know, you're listening and licking non-vanilla with Ralph Greco Jr. and M. Christian. Just to get that in there. Yeah, I mean, I had a buddy of mine who I had dated for a while, and then she was exploring some other avenues, and she was dating this woman,
Hmm.
and so my friend was, I guess they would call hetero-flexible at this point, and this woman she was dating was resolutely homosexual woman, gay woman,
Hmm.
lesbian, and we all went out to get lunch one day, and we were talking. It was this how long ago this was. This was during Britney Spears' first video come out, and this is the video where Britney Spears looks like a little schoolgirl.
Hmm.
Okay, it's a hot video, but I realized watching that video, Britney Spears is an adult woman,
Hmm.
but my friend's girlfriend, new girlfriend, couldn't get over this. She couldn't get over me lusting that way, and she was convinced that I had a thing for younger girls because of this.
Hmm.
And I was like, I know where I'm at. Like I know
Hmm.
for me what's cute there, not because I'm thinking she's younger. She's an adult
Hmm.
woman, and those are those judgments that people make immediately when you say a certain buzzwords. Even when you say pornography and erotica, forget it,
Hmm.
And I always think that you have to take everything by case basis and just slow down a bit,
Hmm.
and not get
Hmm.
so crazed about things. Um,
I completely agree. It's
yeah.
like, and that's true about like erotica. I mean, it's like, it's funny. It's like, I have so many different reactions when I finally tell people I write erotica. I mean, it's like, it's odd. I mean, you probably have exactly these kind of same experiences. I mean, most of the time I just simply say I'm a writer,
Hmm.
because I don't want to get into it, not because I'm
Exactly.
ashamed of it, but sometimes you get these weird reactions.
Exactly.
Um, so it's like I just gotta keep it a little on the QT. But at the same time, it's like on social media, I'm all over the place. It's just in
Hmm.
person, and sometimes I'll get the reaction of like, oh, I've read it plenty, and then they'll mention like 50 Shades of Grey,
Hmm.
or they just get really uncomfortable, or they have no problem with it whatsoever. So it's kind of really interesting to see how that works. I mean, a very few people, and this is why I prize our relationship and our friendship so well, because we both have the same attitude. Is like a lot of people, it's like they don't even think twice. I mean, some people don't even think twice because they understand it's what we do for a living, and it's not because there's some great sexual agenda, or because we're sitting there like, panting and, drooling when we're
Right.
writing this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's just a strange thing because you and I both write a lot of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
erotica and how-tos and straight articles and comics and everything. We're into a lot of stuff. I don't want one thing coming to color the other thing, and somebody say, "Well, you can't do this thing because you do that other thing."
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and I think it's an adult person. Most adult persons I know, or people I know both, um, they have a lot of different interests,
Mm-hmm.
and some would be considered aberrant by others. Some would be
Mm-hmm.
considered mainstream as hell. And so, if you have those kind of interests and you're an adult, and everybody you're coming in contact with is consenting, as you said, and fully aware, then I don't want to be labeled for any of that stuff, whether
Mm-hmm.
I write it or I do it.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And so it's like it's such a weird dichotomy. I think things are gotten better.
Yeah, I think so.
I know for a while there, if you wrote anything that was explicit, you sort of had a kind of like, I mean, unless you're like Chip Delaney, you kind of had to, sort of had to hide it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even though a lot of people were doing exactly the same kind of thing, a lot of writers would like, have a different pseudonym, or, they would just not talk about that side of their career or something similar, even though they, it kept them going for a very long time
Mm-hmm.
financially. So it's one of those kind of like, those kind of weird things. But I do think it's definitely getting a lot better, because even though some people still have a problem with it, at least professionally, 9 out of 10 times people just don't even blink. I mean, it's kind of funny. It's like, when you send off a writing resume somewhere, it's like, it's like you just somebody put in, yes, and I also wrote, bondage tales for, truck
Right.
drivers or something. And it's like, no one seems to mind. I think especially publishers don't seem to mind, because they all know, all they care about is if you're a professional writer or not. They don't care what you're writing.
Right. Yeah, I think most people in the professional field, they realize that, especially if you're a writer, you're just trying to stay alive. So,
Mm-hmm.
if you happen to write this or you happen to write that, doesn't mean you can't write either or both.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that subjective call, I think, is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this can't be stressed enough, because a couple months ago, I saw this report on intimacy coordinators. Have you seen that before?
No, what's
Okay.
about?
What they do is they hire these people to come on movie sets, or like a play that's going up. And this
Mm-hmm.
person is trained, and I don't know how they are trained. And so I guess my language would be a little bit pejorative here, but to intercede when a sex scene comes up,
Oh,
get between
cool.
the director and the people doing the scene. They
Mm-hmm.
come in and talk about the parameters of what's going to happen and make sure everybody's
Cool.
comfortable. Now,
Mm-hmm.
on the overall, that seems like a good idea,
Mm-hmm.
but here's where we come into trouble, and here's where I think we need to take a step back and realize it's a subjective call.
Mm-hmm.
That intimacy coordinator, I guess, if the studio wants to hire them, I don't know how any of that works, but I would think the people who are working, the director and the actors, especially the actors, it's their call if they want that person there.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want that person there if they think it impedes between the director and their action.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we need to have an overall, well, this needs to be there now, implemented all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think these things, we're talking about the labels, we're talking about the assumptions and a subjective nature. I think they all need to be taken with a big, heavy dose of
Mm-hmm.
salt, grain of salt.
I mean, I agree with you to a certain extent. I also think it's like it definitely should be an option. I do think it's like Of course, a lot of it also has to do with like studio responsibility. So it could be also a contractual kind of thing. It
Hmm.
also could be the studio, being proactive around this. I mean, it's like I definitely think it should be like on a case by case basis. But again, there could be other factors as well. It could be like, talent agencies, insisting on it as a matter of policy. It could be all kinds of different things. But it's kind of interesting. It's like, I do love the fact that we are actually now being much more conscientious and aware of it. I mean, that's the biggest thing. It's like there's so many things that used to happen that just simply happen as a matter of course, and now we realize it's like we're really not cool, and cause a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain. But I do think it's interesting how we're still kind of like adapting to this. It's like there's kind of this bipolar attitude. It's like there's some who just like, oh, it's like blaming like PC culture, which I hate that expression. Um, or something like that. And then there's like, on the other end, which is like, such an emphasis that's it's becoming almost kind of like, I don't know. I mean, it's just like it's getting a little extreme, but we're
Right,
still
I
kind of
agree.
working it out, I think, as a culture. We're still trying to figure this whole thing out. It's like, you know, old societal training and habits versus responsibility versus, not if there's such a thing as over responsibility. But yeah, it's definitely, it's like we're still in the middle of like working all this crazy stuff out.
Yeah, and I also often wonder if what we are taking for evolution, getting more aware of things, like you're saying, or like as the kids would say, we're becoming woke,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to, I didn't know we were asleep. I guess we're becoming woke. But the point is that in that, are are we becoming weaker? Are we not being able to navigate the things without the intimacy coordinator?
Mm-hmm.
That's my worry, that as we become more evolved, I see in many, many cases us becoming weaker. We're becoming more dependent on things, and we're
Mm-hmm.
becoming a little scared and reticent to maybe
Mm-hmm.
say things or do things because of, like you're saying, the the overreach, the pendulum
Mm-hmm.
swinging way over. But I don't know, because I mean, being older guys, we we can certainly speak in a group of people our own age, and they all understand us.
Mm-hmm.
We It's harder to communicate with people younger because they come from a different
Mm-hmm.
experience. So I don't know what the answer is. I really don't.
I don't either. I mean, it's like, I mean, I try and stay as progressive as possible and
Hmm.
as aware. And like you said, I try really hard to be as woke as possible because I know what it's like to be on the receiving end, to a certain extent. And so I try and be as responsible, but it's still kind of, odd sometimes because sometimes you'll encounter someone you think is going to be, or a situation that's going to be one way and it's another where you're trying to be as responsible and they're very casual.
Mm.
So it definitely it's really kind of like I said. I think I get the impression, and I don't know where we stand or where it's going to go, but I've always kind of got the impression that it feels like, especially recently, everything's just been thrown in the air. We're waiting for it to come back down, and because right now you're right. There's a certain degree of anxiety. I think it's important for people to be respectful and recognize people, and do things like not misgender and so forth, and and obviously keep your bigotry in your back pocket
Mm.
or remove it as possible. But it's like there's also kind of like this, like you mentioned before, it's like there's a certain degree of like almost anxiety about making mistakes, and that
Mm.
that could also be, a symptom of like, overreaction to like small mistakes. I mean, I'm not talking about big mistakes. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about like, non-consent. I'm not talking about bigotry.
Right.
I'm talking about,
Yeah, putting your hands on
you know,
somebody. Right. Yeah.
things that, well, things that, or like, just an accident. But it's like it's definitely made me, a very, very, it's caused me quite a bit of anxiety because I'm always worried about saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. At the same time, I think this whole thing, spirit is in the right place, and a lot of these issues are my own. And I think it's also very important to keep trying to be as, aware and empathetic as possible, and sort of like just accept the fact that things are changing. But yeah, it's kind of a bonkers time, and it's can be very confusing.
It is. Yeah.
Just trying to navigate this whole new world. But at the same time, I think it's always kind of worth doing. Just because it's like, I think otherwise it's just kind of like, can be borderline abusive, or if not directly abusive. But
Hey,
anyway, but you're right. It's just like, go ahead.
No, I don't mean to cut you off. I just think that because it's things like that too. Like I remember a couple years ago with all the stuff in wherever it was, North Carolina, South Carolina, where there was a lot of the bigotry and the white supremacists and all that kind of stuff, and it was a lot of trouble. A lot of bad stuff went down, people getting hurt. But at the root of all that is, if you're not putting your hands on somebody or throwing a rock at somebody in this country, you can very well have an opinion that's not so nice, or doesn't go along with with being nice to people. You can certainly think the things you want to think, and you can't. I always have this argument. You can't say that's wrong. You could say that's wrong for you, but you can't generally say that it's wrong. If it's somebody's opinion, it can't be wrong. Now, I don't maybe want to play with that person, and I don't particularly want to hear it, but I live in a country where people can say what they want to say, except, you can't yell movie in a crowded firehouse, So it's all these kind of weird gray areas of wanting to be considerate of another person, which I think you and I always were, even when we were younger. Before it became trendy to be woke, we were always those kind of people. And I think no matter what happens, there's always going to be people that aren't, unfortunately. But what I have a problem is when people tell me, like we're saying before, well, you can't be a real writer because you write erotica, right? And you can't have that opinion. You can't think that that group of people are inferior. You just can't think that. That's wrong. Well, it's not wrong. It's an opinion. So that's where I kind of have a problem where we get into that gray area, for whatever it's worth.
Oh, I think everyone has a right to their opinion, but no one has the right to enforce that opinion on somebody else.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing that really bugs me, particularly about like the state of the country right now. It's like, especially when you're talking about things like religion or something similar. It's just like, but at the same time, it's like, you're right. It's like, there's certain like big questions that sort of like, we need to sort of sit down as a society and work out. I completely, I agree that it's just like, your opinion is your own, but once again, when you act on it, or you can harm like, the entire country because of it. You just look at things like, exactly, well, things like the anti-vax people and, and these conspiracy theorists and these bigots, it's like, it's like you can think what you want to think, but this is going beyond your opinion. You're hurting people. You're spreading disinformation. You're harming people by this, by what you're saying. And I think there has to be a certain call of, to hold that kind of behavior accountable. So it's just like, but it's like, it's weird. It's like, we're still trying to work this out. We're just totally confused. And this is a good example, like pornography and erotica again. It's like, it's like, we don't know where the background is. There isn't an algorithm you can plug into a computer somewhere that says, boink, this is erotica and this is pornography, and it's like, so it's kind of the same exact kind of thing. I think if push to shove, I think, for me, it also has to do with like, I don't know. It's like, it could be broken down to being like a matter of intent. But even then, it's like, I've read, mainstream books that had the worst sex scenes in them.
Yeah.
But they're 10 times more explicit than anything I've written for, a very explicit publication. So it's like, I don't know where it stands. I think it's actually kind of interesting that, I think erotica writers or pornographers, however you want to say it, need to start standing up for, and calling people on the carpet about bad sex scenes.
Just
it's like, I know they have that famous award every year for the worst sex scenes, but oh my God, I've read so many bad sex scenes in mainstream fiction. It's like, oh my God, who the hell, taught you about this? It's like, I do not want to take you to bed because you'll be a horrible lover. It's just like, it's just horrible. I mean, it's really, really bad. And it's also funny when you come across people who've never written erotica before, when they try it, it's just like they either they go way overboard or they get really heavy with the metaphors. It's just like, ugh. I mean, it's like,
the old train into the tunnel kind of thing. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh God, yes. I mean, it's like, like we talk about when we teach our erotica writing classes. It's like, in every other writing class, they always teach you never to repeat your words, right? You can repeat it with a certain degree, but you don't say like, you don't describe a truck as being sitting on the rusty ground and it's rusty wheels and so forth. It gets annoying.
Right.
But in erotica, you do want to do that for like body parts, because if you start having to change the metaphor every paragraph, it gets to be really ridiculous. It goes from member to flashlight to baseball bat to it's like like, and you start to really stretch. It's like wheel bearing. I mean, it's just like just come on, just call it what it is. I mean, that's all there is to it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and it's just like, give me a break. Or like my favorite one. This is one that really it's a pet peeve of mine, is when people would describe genitalia, like particularly like like member or sex.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like when you're writing an erotica story, I think you should be true to what you're writing. In other words, if you're writing a story that's set in the 1800s, don't call it like a modern slang term. Try and find what the people would use back then. The same way, if you're writing modern erotica, don't refer to genitalia as their sex, because it sounds like you're writing Victoriana. It's just weird. It's like, if you can't use the words, don't write the erotica.
Yeah.
But that's personal. Again, like I said before, it's subjective.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just like, it's completely subjective. And some people, like, I mean, for God's sakes, I mean, 50 Shades of frickin' Grey sold how many millions of copies, and it's a piece of crap.
Yeah, I think in that case, as we know, we've run across the people who've read it and who have not, people who seem to like it and who don't. I think we've talked about that before in the show. We've talked about that, and the name of the show, by the way, is Licking Non-Vanilla with Ralph Greco Jr. and M. Christian. But I think why that works is that hit a certain part of the population that didn't know about that world. Mm-hmm. So she gave them an entree, relatively well written in her way, with interesting characters in her way, for people who didn't know about that world but were titillated enough to go, wow, I want to know more. And they didn't need the specifics that you and I do, knowing that world. And I think that's kind of why that worked. At right place, right time kind of thing, all that kind of stuff.
Oh, and it's funny because people like to say things like, oh, the fact of the matter is, it's like, now this could be a complete rumor, and I apologize if it is, but I heard also that's like, she also like, knew how to play the social media game very, very well. So it didn't just leap out of nowhere. And it started out as Twilight fan fiction.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
The biggest thing, I mean, I hate that, and we can have a whole show on that, but I hate that book so much. I mean, I hate it, one, because it's badly written. First of all, it's a horrible book. I mean, just bad writing. And it takes a lot for me to say that. But it's also really a criminally awful book, because the behavior of the characters is dangerous. That people think that BDSM is like this makes me just completely furious. Right. By the way, as a sidewind plug, if you get a chance, go to YouTube and type in, I can't remember his name. I'll look it up really quickly here. There's this YouTuber who did a really excellent on the whole 50 Shades series.
Okay.
And I'm going to find his name here really quickly, but he goes way into it more than I could.
Okay.
And I highly recommend that people watch it, because he really gets into the whole thing about it. And it's Dominic Noble.
Okay.
If you go to Dominic Noble, who's a Brit, and I really like his thing. He has this thing called when he does this Lost in Adaptation, where he talks about the differences between books and movies, and he goes into it. He actually has done quite a few really excellent, like, total diatribes against 50 Shades. But I agree with him, because the book is no way, shape, or form anything close to what BDSM is like. In fact, it scares me that people would try BDSM thinking this book is real, because it's totally wrong.
But what happens is, people who don't know
Mm-hmm.
It works for that because it's written on a populist track, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in poppy kind of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So it works for a lot of people who don't know about the community and have never
Mm-hmm.
tried it, but have always been titillated a bit, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and that goes back to, you know, you say potato, I say potato. You know, what's going to
Mm-hmm.
be kinky to somebody else is not kinky to this person. But
Mm-hmm.
somehow she grabbed onto onto something that resonated with a whole bunch of people,
Mm-hmm.
which is
I think a lot of it was like this romance. I mean,
yeah, exactly.
it was like, it
Mommy
had that
porn.
kind of, exactly. It had that kind of, like you said, that kind of mommy porn
Yeah,
kind of like romance connection there. And
absolutely.
it also became kind of like, I think, one of those weird situations too, where it became like the more people heard about it, the more popular it get. And then it kept escalating to a
Yeah, of
certain point
course.
where,
And then it had to be
where it
like
just became a snowball,
you had to read it.
but
You had to read it.
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And but oh, I hate that book. I mean, it's just like, again, it's like, it's funny. It's like I've read a lot of books I've hated. I remember distinctly reading a science fiction novel that had one of the worst depictions of characters and sex in it that was just awful. I'm not going to name the book, but it made me kind of like throw it across the room, because there's one thing when you come across a writer who's like, a complete, says something that's really inappropriate, and
Right,
sometimes that's kind of like when the book was written, and I'm not trying
right.
to excuse it, but sometimes that is the cultural context. Then you come across like writers who are just lazy and they just use cliches and
Yeah,
stereotypes, which is another level of insult. And then you get people who are just like so profoundly naive when it comes to like how characters operate. It just drives me crazy. But yeah, 50 Shades is another one that's just like, oh my god. I mean, but there's unfortunately a lot of them out there. I mean, it's like 50 Shades spawned a whole bunch of people now who are
oh
trying to do the
God.
same thing.
Well, it's funny because
But
yeah, you're right. I mean, you're right. It's funny because I have this weird prejudice where I go, if I buy a book or I get a book, I'm always assuming uh, that it's going to be written at a certain level of competency. Now, you and I both have read fantastic writers. You know,
hmm
you and I are born and bred on guys like we were saying Ellison and Farmer and Isaac Asimov, and these are just the science fiction guys. There's great writers across the board. Bradbury, guys that we love. But I always just assume that I'm going to pick up a book and it's going to be written well.
hmm
And I read a book relatively recently, a fiction book on a subject I was dying to read about, time period, subject, and I'm not going to name it like you just did. But I was like, this is not written all that well. I was kind of like, I want this to be over soon because this isn't written well. And it's just so strange, you know.
Oh, I've read a bunch of those. I know it's exactly. It's like, I don't agree. Certain people. I mean, certain things are just me a style thing.
Yeah.
It's just like, the fact of the matter is, it's like, this is just not written in the style I like.
Right.
Because
Of
there's a lot of
course.
famous writers that I simply just don't like the style of, and so it's hard for me to get into. I'll
Yeah.
try my best to read them, but it's like pulling teeth.
Right.
But then there's other books, like you said, it's like, this guy actually got published. It's like, what the hell? I mean, it's like, did someone read this thing? I mean, it's like, what in the world? And I find that all over the place. I mean, I read a comic book fairly recently. Was just like, seriously, I paid money for this?
It's just so
It's
weird.
like, I want my $3 back. But yeah, it's just like, there's some writers out there just like, really just like, you read them and go like, seriously, this person's famous? And it's like, what the hell? Others are just like, they don't get the breaks because they never get popular, and they're much better writers. But that's kind of the nature of the beast. But yeah, there's like
so
a lot of
strange.
writers that are just like, yeah.
I don't know.
And it's like, and sometimes it's like, they will do one thing well, but not another, or, I mean, that's very famous. And I know, like, for instance, if you get a couple of drinks in us, we'll be free to confess what our weaknesses are.
Right.
But, other writers, it's like, they can do a good plot, but lousy characters, or good characters and no plot, or, the descriptions are great, but the stories are predictable. I mean, it runs the gamut. And sometimes I'll sit down and like read a classic and go like, well, what's the big hubbub about?
I've had that about a bunch of writers, and I always, and we've said this at the top of the show. We're going to say at the end. Now, it's subjective. It's a subjective call. You know.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to thank you for listening this time. We kind of went round and round, but I think we started and ended as best as we could on the question of what is pornography and what is erotica. And I don't think we solved that question, Chris. But I think that's okay. So we're gonna see that. We'll see you next time. Not see you, but we'll talk to you next time. And I had a good time with you as always, Chris. We have a great time talking together, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll see you next time on Licking Non-Vanilla, and have a great week until we talk to you again. Bye-bye.
And visit us on the web at www.lickingnonvanilla.com.